Hey guys, tonight's story is about what it was really like to be one of Zeus's many illegitimate children. The kind of life where you might wake up to a lightning bolt in your crib or your mother whispering, "Don't tell anyone who your father is, ever." Now before you get too comfortable, I'd really appreciate a quick like or a subscribe. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. Bonus points if you're watching in Greece at 2 AM. Now close your eyes, lay back, because tonight you're not just listening to history, you're living it. You were born under suspicious circumstances. Your mother was probably mortal, maybe a nymph, possibly a cow for a brief period, thanks to Zeus's famously creative seduction tactics, which range from golden showers to swan impersonations. And while most kids just had to deal with awkward family reunions, you were navigating the complexities of being half human, half immortal, and 100% resented by Hera. The Queen of the Gods wasn't exactly known for her emotional regulation when it came to Zeus's extracurriculars. She once turned a poor woman into a bear just for looking too content. From the moment you were born, your existence was a ticking divine time bomb. If Hera didn't find you, a rival demigod probably would, hoping to eliminate competition for celestial attention or ambrosia rations. And don't even think about going to Olympus. The gods might tolerate your presence long enough to throw you off a mountain, but not long enough to offer a room and board plan. That was reserved for the official children. You got exile, quests, or, on a good day, some vague prophecy and a suspiciously glowing sword. In ancient Greek society, being a demigod wasn't just myth, it was marketing. Cities would claim descent from divine offspring as a kind of supernatural Yelp review. But behind the statues and the frescoes lay a far grimmer reality. If people found out your dad was Zeus, you might be revered, sure, or sacrificed, or enslaved, or put in charge of pest control because someone thought your divine blood could repel locusts. The myths tend to skip over that part. You weren't raised in a palace. You were hidden in caves, suckled by goats, raised by river reeds, or thrown into wildernesses with nothing but a loincloth and a vague destiny. There were no diapers, just fig leaves and the occasional olive branch if you were feeling luxurious. And don't get too attached to your caretakers. They usually got turned into animals, statues, or plants. In Greek mythology, nurturing mentor figure had a shelf life of about 6 paragraphs. Every meal you ate was a gamble. Pomegranates could trap your soul. Grapes might ferment faster than your liver could evolve. And honey, if it wasn't divine, it was probably filled with ants. Or worse, enchanted to give you visions of your dad's past indiscretions. Most mortals prayed before meals. You prayed after, mostly for survival. Now let's talk puberty, which for demigods came with bonus features like unexplainable strength, sudden glowing, and the uncontrollable urge to slay hydras during what should have been math class. You might sprout wings, you might explode, you might hear your father's booming voice say, "You're destined for greatness," before immediately abandoning you to be raised by wolves. Literally. And relationships? Good luck. Date a mortal and you risk crushing them with your accidental god strength. Date a nymph, and she might vanish into a tree the moment things get serious. Date another demigod, and congratulations, you've just kicked off a generation-long blood feud involving minotaurs, labyrinths, and 12 labours. Romantic getaways rarely survive the second date. In the world of ancient Greece, everything was a warning. Don't fly too high, don't look back, don't eat that, don't trust glowing cows, and above all, don't ever assume your divine parent is going to help you. Zeus was a bit like an absent celebrity father with a lightning fetish and the emotional availability of a rock. Occasionally he might throw you a magical shield or some cryptic dream, but mostly he was busy seducing clouds. Despite it all, you were supposed to be grateful. Grateful that you were part divine. Grateful that your life was a perpetual scavenger hunt with a death toll. Grateful that you might someday become a constellation if you died in a sufficiently dramatic way. The ancient Greeks had a funny way of glorifying trauma. They didn't call it suffering, they called it destiny. But you keep going, because that's what demigods do. You grow into your legacy, you dodge the curses, you wrestle the monsters, you attend temple rituals where the wine is suspiciously fermented and the priests are suspiciously high. You survive, and just when you think you've escaped the madness, Hera finds you again. And so begins the first of many divine misunderstandings, celestial miscommunications and mythological catastrophes that make up your daily routine. You're a child of Zeus, and your life is about to get even more ridiculous. You don't get a welcome party. You get a thunderstorm, a suspicious goat, and a mother who's too afraid to speak your father's name out loud. She knows better. Because in ancient Greece, naming Zeus as your baby daddy is less of a brag and more of a divine death sentence. Especially if Hera finds out. And she always finds out. You learn early that nothing is safe. Not your cradle, not your home, not your sense of identity. Being a child of Zeus means you exist in a permanent state of being hunted by the Queen of the Gods. Hera is not just some pouty divine spouse. She is the official CEO of revenge, and her track record includes turning rivals into cows, cursing babies in the womb, and once setting an entire mountain on fire just because someone flirted with the wrong nymph. Your mother probably tried to hide you in some remote part of Greece, maybe in the mountains of Arcadia or the caves of Crete. That's what they did back then. Out of sight, out of smite. But the problem is that ancient Greek geography was basically a travel brochure for mythological accidents. Every hill had a monster, every spring had a curse, and every fig tree could potentially turn into your aunt if Hera got creative enough. So your hiding place doesn't last long. It never does. The birds start acting strange, the sheep won't stop screaming, the olive oil goes rancid overnight. These aren't coincidences, they're warnings. And when the river starts flowing backward and the local priest starts having prophetic nosebleeds, you know she's close. Hera's tactics weren't limited to thunderbolts. That was Zeus's thing. Hera preferred the slow burn, psychological warfare. She might drive your caretakers mad, or cause your crops to wither, or make every mirror reflect your worst childhood memory. The ancients believed she could send illusions called phantasmata to haunt you in your sleep, often taking the form of your fears. Imagine waking up every night to a chorus of snakes singing your name. That's not symbolism, that's Tuesday. It didn't help that Greek society was obsessed with omens. A sneeze at the wrong moment meant doom. A cat crossing your path meant betrayal. A goose honking at midnight meant Hera was 2 cities away and closing in. There were entire handbooks written by priests on how to interpret signs from the gods. Some were elaborate scrolls filled with diagrams of goat entrails. Others were more casual, like if your barley harvest fails 3 times, stop naming your kids after gods. You start to learn the patterns. Never trust clear skies, never touch golden apples, and never ever accept help from an old woman with suspiciously good posture, because 9 times out of 10, she's Hera in disguise. The Greeks believed that gods could shapeshift at will, and Hera was particularly fond of pretending to be harmless, until she wasn't. Being hunted by a goddess also meant being studied, watched, judged. Every decision you make feels like it's being evaluated by a divine performance review panel. Did you sacrifice enough at the local altar? Did you fast on the correct lunar cycle? Did you accidentally say her name 3 times while holding a pomegranate? Oops. Enjoy your new curse. Curses were an ancient Greek specialty. They came in all flavours: temporary madness, eternal hunger, unstoppable hiccups. One of Hera's rumoured punishments was called melancholia theia, or divine melancholy. It wasn't just sadness, it was an existential collapse so severe that even the bards refused to write songs about it. You didn't cry. You oozed regret from your pores. Some tried to fight back. Bad idea. You're half mortal. She's full immortal. The ancient Greeks were very clear about this hierarchy. Mortals were bugs, gods were bored entomologists. If you showed defiance, Hera didn't just punish you, she made you a lesson. Entire constellations are made of failed demigods. There's a star named after a man who once sneezed during a hymn to Hera. Or so the story goes. You start to develop survival strategies, hide in the temples of other gods, pray loudly and often, offer extra sacrifices, preferably goats, lots of goats. Ancient records show that sanctuaries dedicated to Zeus's offspring often kept entire herds just to appease Hera's jealousy. One inscription from Corinth mentions sacrificing 7 unblemished rams and one particularly handsome lamb every equinox. You can't buy safety, but you can rent it for a season. The irony is that the more you try to hide your divine heritage, the more it leaks out. You glow a little in the dark. You lift things you shouldn't. You accidentally win foot races against horses. People start asking questions. You learn to deflect. I'm just big-boned. It was a lucky throw. No, I didn't wrestle that bull, it tripped. But you know Hera's agents are listening. They always are. Greek literature is filled with stories of Hera's wrath, and it wasn't limited to children. She once cursed a woman named Echo to only repeat the last thing anyone said. Why? Because Echo covered for Zeus. Imagine having your entire personality turned into an audio glitch. That's the level of petty you're dealing with. And still, you persist. Because that's what demigods do. You endure. You dodge lightning and snakes and goats that stare too long. You learn to read the wind, to interpret the colour of the sea, to recognise the scent of divine sulphur in your barley. You become a creature of instinct, part prophet, part fugitive. Eventually you stop asking why Hera hates you. You just accept it. Like gravity, or plague, or your father's baffling inability to keep his toga on. But one day, the storm's quiet. The sheep sleep. The figs ripen without screaming. You begin to suspect that maybe, just maybe, Hera has found a new target. Which means it's time to move. Because the next challenge isn't just survival, it's dealing with the fact that your half-siblings are everywhere, and they're just as cursed as you are. Your first clue that you're not an only child comes when the local oracle starts muttering about a shadow twin born under the same moon. The second clue is when someone shows up in your village claiming to have moved a mountain with their mind. And the third is when a bird drops a scroll on your head, addressed to Zeus's spawn, version 12 through 26, inclusive. You don't need divine revelation to do the math. Your father has been busy. You're not special, you're seasonal. The Greeks had no shortage of stories involving Zeus's prolific offspring. According to ancient myths, he fathered children across every region of the Hellenic world, from Thessaly to Thebes to the back alleys of Crete. If you tossed a stone in ancient Greece, you either hit an olive tree, a cursed nymph, or a demigod half-sibling who now wants to challenge you to a duel. It didn't help that these siblings weren't exactly the share your toys type. Many were raised on prophecy, battle training, and questionable parenting advice from mountain hermits. The ancient Greeks idealized competition. They saw it as divine. Athletic contests, music battles, rhetorical sparring, all were considered ways to gain glory and maybe, just maybe, distract the gods from smiting you. So naturally your siblings didn't want to bond. They wanted to beat you, publicly, preferably while shirtless and covered in olive oil. You might meet one at a sacred festival. The atmosphere smells of roasted goat and arrogance. You lock eyes across a crowd. There's a flicker of divine recognition. The glowing skin, the hair that never tangles, the unearned confidence, and then someone announces a javelin tournament and suddenly you're locked in a silent war of who's the better accident of godhood. Some siblings were raised by royalty, others by shepherds. Some grew up believing they were chosen. Others were taught they were cursed. A few were so deeply in denial that they'd rather believe they were conceived by sunlight or a well-meaning wind spirit than admit their true paternity. Ancient texts refer to demigods born from divine dreams or heavenly mists, which is just poetic Greek for Zeus shape-shifted again, and we're not talking about it. The variety of your half-siblings is staggering. Some can shape-shift, some can talk to animals, some have control over weather, which is delightful until it rains frogs at your birthday. The Greeks didn't have consistency, they had flair. If your sibling could breathe fire, no one asked why. They just built a new altar and hoped for the best. Of course, being related didn't mean getting along. Ancient Greek myths are littered with stories of sibling feuds that ended in curses, betrayals, and the occasional dismemberment. One ancient inscription details a wrestling match between two divine brothers that ended with both of them being turned into lizards by an annoyed priest. This was considered a moral lesson. The lesson was unclear. Jealousy among demigods was more than emotional. It was strategic. Power in the ancient world was believed to be finite. If your sibling gained favour from the gods, it meant less divine attention for you. So rituals became competitions, sacrifices became performance art. At one temple, priests noted that two brothers once tried to outdo each other by offering increasingly absurd gifts to Zeus. One offered golden fig trees, the other offered a captured centaur. The fig trees were cursed, the centaur escaped, the priest retired. It's not just competition, it's paranoia. Some siblings are spies, others are mistakes the gods want erased. You don't know who you can trust. That sibling who brought you a peace offering of honey cakes, it might be poisoned, or enchanted, or just badly baked. Greek cuisine was rarely subtle. The ancients believed in strong flavours and stronger symbolism. Eating the wrong meal could bind your soul to the underworld, or worse, give you visions of your father's next affair. And then there are the alliances. You might find common ground with a sister who was also raised in a cave and has a matching birthmark shaped like a thunderbolt. For a moment, you feel hope, solidarity. And then she casually mentions that she's been blessed by Athena, and you realise you're out of your league. The ancient Greeks loved hierarchy, and nothing re-established your place in it, like watching a sibling levitate during family gatherings. Of course, none of you have an inheritance. Zeus doesn't leave wills, he leaves riddles, prophecies, vague promises that if you fulfill your destiny, you'll achieve immortality. What he doesn't mention is that immortality is often just being turned into a constellation after you're dead. Congratulations, you're a pattern of stars now. Please enjoy being misidentified as a scorpion for the next 1,000 years. Sibling dynamics in the ancient world were brutal. If you didn't compete, you vanished. If you lost, you were forgotten. Fame meant survival. Reputation was currency. And being the quiet, thoughtful demigod who respected boundaries, that just meant you'd be the first to be turned into a cautionary tale. Even the Olympians modelled this dysfunction. Zeus himself had plenty of siblings. He overthrew most of them. Hades got the underworld, Poseidon got the sea, Hera got a lifetime subscription to resentment and passive aggression. Greek mythology wasn't a family tree, it was a family minefield. You try to play it cool, you smile at reunions, you offer sacrifices, you pretend not to notice when your brother starts glowing during an argument, but deep down, you know the truth. Being one of Zeus's children means your greatest threats are often your closest relatives, and if Hera doesn't destroy you, a sibling probably will, by accident, or ambition, or because they misread a prophecy and thought you were the one destined to betray them. So you keep moving, keep training, keep sacrificing to whatever minor god might be watching. You embrace solitude, even when it aches, because trust is dangerous, and loyalty is optional. And somewhere out there, another sibling is waking up with a strange birthmark, a sense of destiny, and an unhealthy desire to outshine you. And the cycle begins again. You've learned not to look up. Not because the sky's ominous, though it often is, but because sometimes there's an eagle watching you. And it's not just any eagle, it's the eagle, the one Zeus sends when he's bored, suspicious, or vaguely paternal. It perches in trees that weren't there yesterday. It blinks too slowly. It always knows your name. And worst of all, it never blinks when you curse under your breath. Ancient Greeks believed the gods saw everything, not through magic mirrors or glowing pools, but through nature itself. Birds were divine text messages. Winds carried secrets. The rustling of leaves could be a warning or a wink depending on the direction. Entire careers were built around interpreting this stuff. These weren't your garden variety priests. These were professional omen readers, augurs, haruspices, men who made a living watching birds and then charging people to explain what it meant when a sparrow flew left after sneezing twice. And if you were a child of Zeus, you were always under surveillance, not metaphorically, literally. The gods had spies everywhere. A goat with unsettling eye contact, a snake that never blinks, a cloud that looks suspiciously like your father's nose. You learned not to trust anything that moved without wind or blinked without rhythm. Because if something was watching, it was probably judging. Ancient texts describe animals acting as extensions of divine will. Eagles for Zeus, peacocks for Hera, owls for Athena. If you saw any of these animals too often, it meant a god was nearby or at least paying attention. And when gods paid attention, things got weird. One boy reportedly saw a fox every day for 2 years. Eventually he turned into a river. No one explained the connection. They just carved it on a vase and called it a myth. You begin to notice the patterns. The way the frogs croak before you lie. The way the wind changes direction when you doubt your destiny. The way a shadow stretches just a little too far at noon. It isn't paranoia, it's pattern recognition. Greek life was structured around divine scrutiny. Every hiccup, every sneeze, every bad harvest could be interpreted as a sign that you had angered someone powerful, or worse, disappointed them. This wasn't exclusive to the children of gods, of course. The entire Greek world operated on the assumption that the divine was watching and taking notes. Public rituals were performed with exhausting precision, because one missyllable in a hymn could result in crop failure or spontaneous boils. Inscriptions show that some towns employed multiple diviners just to cross-check omens, like a divine version of a peer review system. If 3 different birds flew east at sunrise, they'd cancel the marketplace and sacrifice a goat just to be safe. But for you, the scrutiny never stops. You can't have a bad day. You can't throw a rock without wondering if it'll trigger a curse. One demigod once tripped on a temple step and was immediately struck with a lifetime of prophetic visions about barley prices. Not every punishment is dramatic. Some are just exhausting. Even dreams aren't private. The Greeks believed that Morpheus, the god of dreams, could be manipulated by the Olympians. Zeus might send you visions of your future, wrapped in metaphor and covered in fog. Hera might fill your sleep with whispering cows. You'd wake up drenched in sweat and unsure whether you needed therapy or an exorcism. Worse still is the fear of prophecy. Not just hearing one, but becoming one. You might start muttering strange truths without meaning to. You might touch a rock and suddenly understand the future of your village's cheese exports. Or you might sneeze and someone nearby assumes it's an omen and starts building a shrine. That's how reputations started. Not with deeds, with allergies. And then there are the masks, not the physical kind, but the metaphorical ones. The gods didn't always use animals, sometimes they used people. That nice old woman who gave you a barley cake, that might have been Hera. The drunk shepherd who warned you about lightning storms before disappearing into thin air, that might have been Hermes doing a performance piece. The Greeks believed the gods walked among mortals often, usually to test them or mess with them. There was no such thing as a normal day. Every stranger might be sacred. Every insult might echo through eternity. Some people try to shield themselves. wear amulets, burn incense, chant protection spells passed down from generation to generation. One fragment of an ancient household manual recommends placing a garlic braid over your door and spitting 3 times before saying Zeus's name. Not because it helped, but because it made you feel like you had control. The illusion of protection was often more comforting than the reality of being helpless before divine whims, and still, you perform. You smile at the eagle, you bow to the shadow, you speak politely to inanimate objects, just in case one of them is hosting a minor deity. You avoid mirrors during eclipses and never whistle after dusk. You follow the rules, all of them, even the ones that contradict each other, because you're being watched all the time. There are no private moments, no safe words, no off the record. Your life is a theatre. The audience is immortal, and the reviews are written in thunder. But occasionally, in the stillness between omens, you feel something else. Not fear, not pressure. Purpose. You're being watched because you matter. Because your existence, however messy, however inconvenient, is a reminder that the gods are not untouchable. They break rules, they make mistakes, they leave legacies, and you are one of them. Which makes your next challenge even harder, because now you have to learn how to pray, and not to the gods who made you, but to the ones who might still be listening. So now you know you're being watched, constantly, judged by eagles, evaluated by trees, possibly audited by the occasional enchanted goat. You've accepted that, mostly. But now comes the real headache. You have to pray, not because you're spiritual, not because you're devout, but because if you don't, the rain stops, the figs rot, and your left eye starts twitching during thunderstorms. And praying, in ancient Greece, isn't easy. It's not a personal moment. It's not whispered sincerity or a poetic reflection under moonlight. It's a bureaucratic performance with fire, smoke, and a high chance of being smited if you get the phrasing wrong. Greek religion wasn't designed to comfort, it was designed to appease. First, you need to know which god you're talking to. This sounds obvious, until you remember that there were hundreds: major gods, minor gods, local gods, abstract concept gods, gods of specific trees, gods of specific feelings. There was a river god whose entire domain was wet ankles. There was a goddess of mild irritation who once had a temple built after someone sneezed in a sacred spring. If you pray vaguely, you don't just risk being ignored. You risk offending 20 gods by omission. So you do your research. You consult a seer, bribe a priest, throw pebbles into a sacred fountain until the ripples form something vaguely bird-shaped. Eventually you pick your target. Let's say it's Apollo. Good reputation, handles light, music, prophecies, and possibly gluten. Seems safe. But now you have to prepare your prayer. This isn't casual. There are steps. First you cleanse yourself. This means bathing in cold water, usually at dawn, while reciting verses that rhyme in ancient Doric. If you get the intonation wrong, the purification doesn't count. If you sneeze mid-syllable, it's considered an omen. If you stub your toe on the way back to the altar, start over. The gods are nothing if not particular. Then you need an offering, not just anything, something the god actually likes. Apollo enjoys laurel branches and lyre music. Hera prefers peacocks and self-righteous loyalty. Dionysus wants wine, but not the cheap kind. The Greeks believed the gods had refined tastes. They also believed that gods could smell a subpar goat from 3 cities away. Your offering isn't just a gift, it's a resume. And your resume better not be mouldy. If you're lucky, you're at a temple. Temples came in all shapes and sizes. Some were grand marble columns bathed in incense and gold. Others were wooden shacks with suspicious altars and a priest who smells like fermented onions. Regardless, the ritual is the same. Approach, bow 3 times, place your offering, speak the prayer, loudly, clearly, and without improvisation. because the gods hate improv. Your words must be exact. Many ancient prayers were pre-written, sometimes inscribed on tablets or scrolls. The phrasing had to follow formulaic patterns, address the god with epithets, flatter them excessively, remind them of past favours, then, and only then, make your request, modestly. Never beg, never demand, and never ask for something that contradicts another god's jurisdiction. Requesting good sailing weather from Poseidon while also asking for a peaceful forest hunt from Artemis, that's divine conflict. You're now a theological time bomb, and whatever you do, don't forget the closing. The Greeks believed that improperly ending a prayer could undo the entire ritual. You had to finish with a gesture, a bow, a touch of the altar, a spoken phrase like, "So let it be." If you wandered off mid-sentence, the gods might assume you were mocking them. One man reportedly forgot the closing phrase and was struck with boils that spelled out the rest of the prayer. Ancient graffiti later used him as a cautionary example. Even silence could be risky. If a prayer was made without a witness, it might be considered void. If it was made too publicly, the gods might view it as arrogance. Some cities employed professional mourners or singers to stand near altars and hum melodically, just in case the prayer needed ambient support. One hymn to Demeter includes instructions for a background flute to be played specifically in B-flat minor, because that was her favourite key. According to one very nervous priest, she once scorched an olive grove because someone brought a harp instead. Then there's the problem of divine overlap. Many gods had similar jurisdictions. Zeus controlled the sky, but so did Apollo, and Hera, indirectly. And then there were spirits of the wind, and cloud nymphs. You might pray for rain, and accidentally invoke 5 gods at once. If they disagree on how much you deserve it, you get a hailstorm, a lightning bolt, and a chorus of frogs screaming in your garden. And let's not even talk about forgotten gods. Ancient Greek history is full of once revered deities that were quietly retired when their temples fell out of use. But no one told them, so now they linger, listening, waiting. If your prayer accidentally echoes one of their rituals, they might show up. Confused, bitter, petty. Suddenly your peaceful moonlit request for safety turns into a surprise haunting from the forgotten god of mild indigestion. He demands a burnt offering of oregano and recites riddles that make your eyes itch. This is your life now. Prayer isn't comfort, it's project management. Each word a negotiation, each gesture a contract. And you, a half-divine intern hoping your dad's name gets you through the celestial red tape. You never relax, not during rituals, not after. Even gratitude is complicated. You must thank the god properly and publicly. If you forget, they might take back the favour, or worse, punish you for the presumption. One traveller once forgot to thank Hermes after a safe journey. His shoes turned to bees. The myth doesn't explain what that meant, but everyone involved agreed it was unpleasant. And somehow, through it all, you're still expected to be humble. You're a demigod, a mistake, a footnote in a scroll no one finishes, and still you're expected to bow, offer, flatter, and pray, because the gods are listening, and now, unfortunately, so are the dead, and they are far less polite. You start to notice them around the 5th time you burn incense incorrectly. Not that you were expecting applause, but you also weren't expecting a translucent man with goat teeth and a toga from 3 centuries ago to appear in your doorway muttering about wheat prices and disrespectful grandchildren. He doesn't say much at first, just hovers, judging your posture, watching you pray, sighing a little louder each day. Until one night, he clears his throat and offers his thoughts on your sacrificial technique. This is not entirely unexpected. In ancient Greek belief, the dead were rarely silent. They lingered in thresholds, sacred groves, family tombs, and occasionally the bottom of your wine jug. Death, to the Greeks, was porous. The boundaries between the living and the dead weren't walls. They were more like loosely hung curtains with a few moth holes. Souls weren't gone, they were redistributed. And if you left an opening, a cracked door, an unfinished prayer, an improperly salted stew, they might slip through. They weren't necessarily malevolent, but they were vocal. The dead had opinions, mostly about ritual, etiquette, and how things were better before you were born. You learn quickly that some of them are your ancestors, others are vague family associates. A few are entirely unrelated but claim they were promised free lodging if they offered career guidance to divine bastards like you. And a handful are just bored. Death is long. Complaining is timeless. The Greeks took this seriously. Ancestor worship wasn't optional. It was essential. Every household was expected to perform regular rituals to honour the dead. These weren't funeral anniversaries. These were scheduled maintenance, monthly offerings, libations, cakes, whispered apologies to great uncles you never met for accidentally moving the urn without bowing first. Inscriptions from classical Athens detail entire household schedules built around tending to the family dead. One text from the 4th century BCE recommends leaving portions of every meal on a dedicated stone, just in case the spirits were hungry, and gods help you if you ate it afterward. That was considered spiritual theft and could result in chronic toe pain or dreams where fish judged your life choices. As a child of Zeus, your spiritual traffic is heavier than most. Your bloodline acts like a divine antenna. If a spirit is roaming nearby and smells ambrosia in your bloodstream, they show up. Not to harm you, not directly, but to chat, to advise, to offer their take on your latest battle, quest, or dramatic monologue under the stars. One particularly enthusiastic ghost insists on critiquing your sword grip every time you practice. He doesn't have hands, but he does have opinions. It gets worse when you visit necromantic sites. Ancient Greece had several locations believed to be direct portals to the underworld. The most famous, the Necromanteon of Hera, was a state-sanctioned spirit-summoning facility complete with a waiting chamber, purification rooms, and a theatrical descent into a dark tunnel that definitely didn't comply with modern fire codes. Pilgrims would bring offerings, sleep on animal skins, and fast until the veil between worlds was thin enough to pierce. Some would speak to dead relatives. Others received cryptic visions. A few just got sick from the fumes and wandered home with a new fear of ducks. Ancient records don't always clarify. You avoid these places, mostly. But sometimes a voice calls, not metaphorically, literally, from a cold wind, a ripple in the surface of your wine, a shadow that moves against the grain of the sun, and you know you're being summoned, not by a god, but by someone who used to know one. When the dead arrive, they don't float, they shuffle, they flicker. They smell of ash and old scrolls. They rarely announce their names. Names are weighty in the afterlife. To speak one is to stir the dust of memory. Instead, they offer context. I was the one who buried the spear under the temple. I once carried a torch into the belly of the mountain. I knew your grandmother before she was reborn as a fig tree. Some are helpful. They warn you of omens. They remind you to kneel during eclipses. They tell you which direction not to face when sacrificing a goat. Others are less so. One refuses to leave unless you name your next child after him. Another insists that your destiny involves potatoes, which haven't been invented yet. You suspect he might be from the future, or just lonely. The dead, like the gods, have their own social structures. They argue, they organise, they maintain grudges. Some spend centuries trying to correct historical inaccuracies in their biographies. One ghost you encounter spends every visit reading a list of his battlefield accomplishments, while correcting the number of enemy teeth he dislodged with his elbow. You nod politely. He weeps with gratitude. You've now gained a patron spirit who whispers tips during your sparring matches. Sometimes useful, sometimes wildly outdated, always enthusiastic. You start to adjust your routine. You leave room for spirits. You set an extra cushion near the hearth. You nod when the wind carries a chill at midday. You pour wine slowly and whisper apologies when you spill. You don't just live among the dead, you accommodate them. Because to the Greeks, ignoring the dead was dangerous. They could become restless, vengeful, infected with longing. There's a reason so many tragedies begin with improper burial rites. The ancients believed a soul-denied ritual would haunt the living until appeased, or until they found someone new to mentor. And of course, some of them want more than conversation. They want you to fulfill their legacies, reclaim their honour, finish their quests. One spirit insists you recover a stolen lyre from a long-crumbled city. Another begs you to avenge his lost sandal, stolen during a sacred foot race in 610 BCE. You suspect he's exaggerating, but just in case, you leave a sandal at the altar. He stops appearing. You assume that's a win. It becomes normal. The flicker of eyes in mirrors, the scent of myrrh where none was burned, the soft weight of memory pressing against your spine during prayers. You don't flinch anymore. You acknowledge. You accept. You respond when addressed. You pause when the wind asks you to. Because death isn't the end here. It's just another voice in the chorus. And as one of Zeus's illegitimate children, your life is an open invitation to every opinion that ever refused to die. But then one night, you see something new. Not a ghost, not a god, but a thing that walks between them. And it's not here to advise, it's here to warn. It's just past midnight when you hear it. Not a whisper, not a growl, but something between a burp and a hymn, echoing from the hills. Something is out there, circling, not to attack, but to say hello. The monsters have found you, and it turns out they think you're one of them, which is awkward. You don't remember signing up for the monster family tree, but in ancient Greece, monster was more of a flexible label than a biological fact. The Greeks didn't believe in neat categories. They believed in hybrids, mutations, punishments wrapped in scales and tentacles. Many monsters were former mortals or minor deities who were cursed, twisted, or reborn through some divine scandal no one wanted to talk about at the dinner table. And more often than not, those scandals had something to do with Zeus, which means that technically, many of them are your extended family. You start seeing them around the edges, a flash of horns near the olive grove, a hiss beneath your sandals, a shadow the size of a small amphitheatre scuttling across the sky like it's late for an appointment. None of them attack. Not at first. They're curious, and a little bit offended that it's taken you this long to show up. The ancient Greeks had no shortage of these creatures: the chimera, the hydra, the sphinx, the gorgons. Each one a terrifying blend of parts that should never have been combined. Lion heads with goat spines, snake hair with petrifying eyesight, bird women who sang sailors into madness. And those were just the well-known ones. There were regional monsters too, local abominations lovingly documented by terrified poets and confused farmers, like the one-eyed donkey that recited legal codes backwards, or the cow with two mouths, one of which only complained. They weren't just stories, they were warnings. The Greeks believed monsters existed on the edge of the known world, in caves, at the tops of mountains, deep in forests where the sunlight filtered in like bad omens. But they also believed these creatures served a purpose. They tested mortals. They punished arrogance. They reminded the world that the gods were not done being weird. And if you're a child of Zeus, you're part of that weirdness. Your very existence is a footnote in some mythological creature's trauma. You're the symbol of divine inconsistency, a living monument to broken rules and unfinished prophecies. To the monsters, you're not a hero. You're a cousin, a rival, or at the very least someone they once heard about through a prophecy involving flaming goats and an upside-down altar. They start to approach, not aggressively, more like old friends with boundary issues. One brings a gift, a rock shaped like your head. Another recites a poem about a battle you haven't fought yet. You nod, smile, and inch backward toward the temple gates. They don't follow, they just watch, waiting. You consult the elders, the ones who still remember the ancient stories. They tell you that monsters aren't just born, they're maintained through fear, ritual, and careful ignorance. The moment you start to see them as part of the system, they lose their edge. But the moment you dismiss them entirely, they grow stronger. One priest once tried to declare a valley monster-free by decree. The next morning his temple turned into a giant snail, with teeth. Some monsters are protectors, guardians of sacred places, testers of human arrogance. Others are just lost souls who missed their chance at reincarnation and are now stuck in a permanent loop of screaming and devouring. You never know which type you're dealing with until it's too late. One might offer you directions, another might offer you your own limbs back in a slightly altered configuration. You start to recognize the signs, a sudden silence from birds, a warm wind that smells like boiled olives, stones stacked in unnatural formations. These are warnings, or invitations, depending on the mood of the creature in question. The Greeks didn't believe monsters were evil, they believed monsters were necessary. They filled the gaps in logic, they explained misfortune, they justified heroism, and in your case, they complicate everything. Because while some monsters respect your divine blood, others resent it. You didn't earn it, you were born into it, and worse, you haven't done anything monstrous yet. No village scorched, no prophecy fulfilled, no grand battle where you lose a limb and gain a moral lesson. You're just surviving, and in their eyes that's boring. One particularly vocal beast accuses you of being a disappointment. He was expecting a firestorm. You brought sandals and mild anxiety. You apologize. He sighs, offers you a cursed sandwich. You decline. He disappears into a hole in the ground with a muttered comment about standards slipping since the Bronze Age. You begin to suspect that the line between demigod and monster is thinner than anyone admits. Some of your siblings crossed it ages ago, driven mad by power or loneliness, or the constant pressure to be legendary. Their names are whispered now, not as heroes, but as warnings. One was said to have turned into a storm, another became a river that refuses to run east. A few are sealed in jars, others are statues with expressions that suggest they've seen things no poem will ever capture. And yet, despite all this, you're still invited. The monsters extend a kind of grim solidarity. They know what it's like to be the byproduct of divine decisions no one voted on. They know what it's like to be hunted, feared, and explained away in bedtime stories. You're not one of them. Not exactly, but you're close enough. You start to listen, not just to the humans, but to the growls beneath the earth. The songs sung by creatures with 7 tongues and no sense of harmony. The ancient ones who remember the world before temples, before laws, before anyone tried to categorize what was sacred and what was just misunderstood. They tell you things, not all of it helpful, but none of it boring. You're learning, slowly. That being a child of Zeus isn't about glory or prophecy, our lineage. It's about navigating a world where everything is alive, opinionated, and slightly offended you haven't bowed yet. And just when you think it can't get weirder, the Oracle sends for you. Because apparently you've been volunteered for a quest, and it starts with finding your own missing destiny, which someone may have pawned in a drunken bet with a river. The Oracle calls for you just after dawn. You don't know how. You never met her. You never signed up for updates. But somehow, your name is scrawled on a cracked tablet and handed to you by a man wearing sandals made from reeds and goat hair. He says nothing, just points toward the mountains. You ask for details. He hands you a fig and disappears. This is considered normal. In ancient Greece, oracles weren't optional. They were mandatory checkpoints for anyone tangled in myth, fate, or divine bureaucracy. If you existed anywhere near a prophecy, you visited one. If you refused, life had a way of reminding you, through plagues, through inexplicable goat behaviour, through the haunting sound of your own name whispered by breezes that shouldn't know how to pronounce it. So you go. The path is long, dry, and smells like time, panic, and bad decisions. You reach the temple just before noon. It's cracked and leaning slightly, like a building that's seen too many fates pass through its columns. Inside, the oracle is draped in layers of fabric, incense, and vague irritation. She doesn't greet you, she just groans, hurls a handful of barley into the air, and declares that your destiny is missing. Not lost. Missing. Apparently there was a prophecy. A big one. You were supposed to fulfill it. Only now, no one can find it. The scroll's gone. The wax tablet melted. The backup clay version crumbled after a pigeon used it as a landing platform. You ask how something that important could vanish. She tells you it happens more often than you think, especially with demigods. You're a messy demographic. This is when she introduces the statue. It's about your height, slightly chipped, and has the expression of someone who's been asked to relive the same dramatic monologue for 3 centuries. According to the oracle, the statue once held your destiny in its stone mouth. It used to recite it on command, but recently it started quoting other destinies. Random ones, sometimes contradictory, sometimes insulting. You ask the statue what your future holds. It says you will die of a sandwich-related injury in a city that doesn't exist yet. You thank it. The oracle shrugs. The Greeks believed in fate, but they also believed fate had a sense of humour. Destiny wasn't a straight line. It was a crooked river filled with contradictions, detours, and family drama. Even the gods weren't exempt. Zeus himself had to follow the decrees of the Moirai, the 3 fates, who spun, measured, and cut the threads of life. Not even thunderbolts could override them, but mortals were left to interpret and misinterpret. The ancient world was flooded with prophecies, some legitimate, some wildly made up by drunk priests hoping to sell more incense. Entire wars started because someone misread a chicken's liver. Cities relocated based on dreams involving citrus fruit and suspicious owls. One man reportedly changed his name to avoid fulfilling a prophecy, only to trip over his new name written on a tavern wall and fall into a well. The lesson? You don't dodge fate, you just reschedule it. You try to find leads, old temple records, forgotten scrolls. A librarian in Athens thinks she saw something about you filed under minor anomalies. You bribe her with a bronze comb and 3 questions she can use during her next divination. She hands you a scroll. It's in verse, bad verse. Written by someone who clearly had a grudge against meter and clarity. You spend 3 days decoding it, and realise it might not be about you at all. It might be about a goat. This is also normal. Many prophecies were ambiguous on purpose. The Greeks understood that clarity ruined drama. Oracles like the one at Delphi were famous for phrasing predictions so broadly that almost any outcome could be interpreted as fulfillment. If your prophecy said you would rise above kings, it could mean you'd rule, or that you'd be buried on a hill. Eventually you discover that your destiny may have been intercepted, not stolen, not hijacked, just redirected. Apparently a temple scribe misfiled a batch of scrolls. Several destinies were shuffled. A fisherman now thinks he's supposed to found an empire. A boy in Sparta has taken a vow of silence because he believes he's the future oracle of pine cones. And your fate. The one about thunder and legacy and echoing across generations. It's with a statue, not the one you met earlier, a different one. In a city that worships household objects, you find the city by accident. It's small, mostly stone, and populated by people who speak exclusively in riddles. Every object here is sacred. A clay jug receives offerings of cheese. A broom has a priest. The statue holding your prophecy is treated like a celebrity. It has its own robe, its own platform, a dedicated temple boy who oils its elbows every morning. You ask for the scroll. The priest tells you it's not yours anymore. You explain your situation. He nods, offers you a date, and says the statue will speak at moonrise. When it does, it recites your destiny, loudly, elegantly, in 6 languages. The crowd applauds. Then the statue coughs and continues. Apparently your prophecy was merged with 4 others, one involving a turtle king, one about the invention of soup, one predicting a solar eclipse that already happened, and a recipe for lentil cakes. You don't know which part is yours. No one does. The priest shrugs and tells you the gods are fickle. You nod, thank the statue, leave an offering of olives and disappointment. Back at your camp, the oracle sends word that another oracle has a partial backup of your prophecy. It was written on fish bones. You'll have to travel 2 weeks inland and consult a man who believes he's allergic to destiny. He only speaks in verbs. You pack your things. You don't know if you'll ever get your original destiny back. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the real Greek experience isn't about following prophecy. Maybe it's about surviving the paperwork and trying not to get cursed by a chair that thinks it's your grandmother. It starts innocently enough. A wooden stool creaks when you sit on it. Nothing unusual, until it creaks again when you stand up, and then once more when you turn your back, just slightly louder. You stare at it. It stares back, or you think it does. You lean in closer. It lets out what can only be described as a disappointed sigh. And that's when it hits you. This stool might be family. You'd laugh if the implications weren't so completely in line with everything else you've learned about your lineage. Because in ancient Greece, the boundaries between human, divine, object, and animal were more like vague guidelines than actual rules. The gods transform themselves constantly, into birds, into clouds, into bulls, into beams of light. Zeus alone was responsible for half a zoological chart's worth of seduction tactics, which meant that, at any given time, an animal in your vicinity might not only be magical, it might also be your half-brother. This wasn't symbolic. This was taken quite literally. Myths are filled with people turning into animals, animals turning into people, trees turning into nymphs, nymphs turning into mist, and mist turning into a moral lesson delivered in verse. There are stories of people being turned into laurel trees, reeds, bears, crickets, and even puddles. Some were transformations of mercy, others were punishments. A few were simply divine boredom weaponized into permanent life changes. And since you're the illegitimate child of Zeus, your family tree doesn't have branches, it has spirals. Chaotic, dripping, often smoking spirals filled with creatures that defy anatomy and sometimes basic logic. The Greeks understood this. They didn't question why the goose was crying or why the stone bled when cracked open. They just assumed someone annoyed a god, and now everything was weird forever. Take the story of Io, one of the many mortals caught in Zeus's wake. Hera, in one of her less generous moods, turned her into a cow. Not metaphorically, literally. The woman spent years mooing her way across the Mediterranean, chased by a gadfly and existential dread. Another story features a woman turned into a tree just for praying too long near a sacred grove. And let's not forget the man who was transformed into a swan and then immediately eaten by a confused, divinely enchanted wolf. You begin to realise the practical consequences. You can't insult your furniture. You can't shoo animals without apologising first. That frog you nearly stepped on might be your uncle. That broom you snapped in half during a thunderstorm could have been a cousin. Even your sandals start to feel personal. You begin offering olive oil to your doormat just in case. Temples didn't help with this. Many had relics believed to be former people, objects that once contained souls, or served as the final resting place for someone who displeased the gods. One temple boasted a bronze door knocker that used to be a prince. Another claimed their ceremonial spoon was actually a demigod caught in mid-transformation. Pilgrims were encouraged to pat it for luck. You did not. It's not just divine punishment. Sometimes it's divine intimacy. Zeus wasn't the only shapeshifter. Apollo turned into a dolphin once to lead sailors to shore. Artemis transformed a hunter into a stag just for seeing her bathe, and he was torn apart by his own hounds, which, again, might have been cousins. The line between affection, revenge, and metaphysical experimentation was never clearly marked. Animals, too, were often seen as incarnations or hosts of divine energy. Birds were messengers. Snakes were symbols of prophecy. Cats, though rare in Greek iconography, were still occasionally tied to household spirits. And if one followed you home, you were expected to name it after a god, feed it wine-soaked bread, and consult it on major life decisions. Several ancient households had designated animal oracles, usually chickens or goats, that answered questions by which direction they faced after spinning in a circle. These answers were treated with more respect than most legal rulings. Even statues weren't exempt. The Greeks believed that statues of gods, especially when properly consecrated, could speak, move, sweat, and occasionally judge you. One account describes a temple where a statue of Hera would tip slightly to the left if displeased by a visitor's sandals. Another claimed that a marble likeness of Ares once wept when someone confessed they forgot to burn incense before making a wish. People began leaving apologies on stone tablets. Eventually they ran out of space and started carving them onto the temple floor. Now, in your case, things are even murkier, because your divine blood acts like a magnet for weirdness. If a tree is going to talk to someone, it's going to talk to you. If a table is going to sigh dramatically, it's going to do it while you're eating. And if a pebble is going to recite half a prophecy in ancient Aeolic, it will do it right as you're trying to fall asleep. You become hyper-aware of everything. You knock on doors before entering rooms, not for politeness, for self-preservation. You ask your shadow for permission before stepping on it during solstice. You avoid using spoons that make eye contact. You keep your tools in pairs just in case one gets lonely. This is how people like you live. Not because you're superstitious, but because you've already seen too much to assume anything is inanimate forever. There's a dignity to it. A strange, reverent chaos. The Greeks didn't separate life into neat boxes. Everything was alive, everything had spirit, and everything could become family, if not by birth, then by magic, or mistake, or because Zeus once got curious during a thunderstorm and now your cousin is a butter churn. And when you finally return to your camp tired, achy, and no longer entirely sure if your belt buckle is sentient, you find a note carved into the side of your bedpost. It's a warning. It says you're being followed, not by a god, not by a monster, but by something older, something that remembers the world before gods had names, and it knows your bloodline. The warning carved into your bedpost doesn't vanish. If anything, it deepens overnight, like the wood itself is thinking harder about it. You try not to panic. This isn't your first supernatural message. You've received prophecies in spilled wine, advice from a constipated goat, and once, a weather forecast whispered through the teeth of a river. But this one feels different, heavier, older, like it wasn't sent. It was waiting. You suspect it's a curse, not a new one, a legacy curse, the kind that isn't cast in anger, but inherited, like property, or a nose shape, or that one relative no one talks about but everyone mysteriously resembles. Ancient Greece was full of curses. The word itself, ara, could mean anything from a harsh insult to a multi-generational spiritual catastrophe. There were personal curses, public curses, sacred curses, professional curses, curses for cheating in athletic competitions, and curses for using the wrong incense on the wrong day while wearing the wrong sandals. It wasn't hard to get cursed. It was harder to realise you'd been cursed 6 generations ago by someone who insulted a minor harvest deity and never apologised properly. They didn't die with the original offender. They stuck around, they grew roots, they curled into the family line like sour wine into a cracked jug. And once there, they got comfortable. Some families were famous for their curses. The House of Atreus, for instance, managed to squeeze at least 4 generations of murder, cannibalism, betrayal, and divine retribution into one dramatic bloodline. That wasn't just poor decision-making, that was a curse operating on full-time salary with benefits and sick leave. The Greeks didn't see these as coincidence. They saw them as spiritual debts, and they believed the only way to break a curse was to fulfill it, which means you can't escape it. You have to carry it, like a stone in your pocket, like a riddle you're only half qualified to solve. You start looking for signs, unexpected rot, itching you can't explain, a cat that keeps sitting on your bed and staring directly into your soul before meowing in what sounds suspiciously like ancient Doric. These aren't just annoyances, they're signals. The curse is active, or waking up, or maybe just stretching after a long, bitter sleep. You visit a curse reader. She's blind in one eye, surrounded by copper mirrors, and refuses to speak above a whisper. She holds your hand, tilts her head, and immediately begins weeping. You ask if it's that bad. She says no, she's just allergic to divine lineage. Then she tells you that your curse is woven, not a single knot, a tapestry. Layers of resentment, jealousy, unfinished rituals, and one very specific insult muttered in a temple on the wrong festival day by someone you're probably related to. You ask what the insult was. She says it involved figs. You don't press further. Ancient Greeks documented curses in meticulous detail. Curse tablets, or defixiones, were common. Thin sheets of lead, inscribed with precise wording, often folded and nailed into tombs or wells to reach the underworld. Thousands have been found, listing everything from love hexes to business rivalries to sporting sabotage. One reads simply, "May he trip every time he feels confident." Another says, "May her pies always fall apart." And some are full-blown legal documents addressed to chthonic gods, outlining grievances with supporting evidence and a suggested punishment schedule. The power wasn't in the rhyme or the dramatics, it was in the ritual, the placement, the wording, the belief. The Greeks saw curses as contracts. You didn't just curse someone, you involved deities, you submitted paperwork, and if you were the cursed, you had to respond in kind. You try to break it. You burn herbs. You fast during moonless nights. You bathe in streams at dawn while reciting apologies you don't understand. You offer gifts to the restless dead. One night, you sleep with a stone under your tongue, hoping it draws the curse out through your dreams. You wake up choking on feathers. There were no birds in camp. This is not an improvement. You consider finding the source, the original offence. But your family history is a bit of a disaster. Zeus didn't keep records, and your mortal lineage involves enough scandal, betrayal, and ceremonial mishaps to justify a small epic. You ask an oracle. She tells you to stop asking questions unless you're willing to become the answer. You take that as a yes, so you research. You find that curses can be passed along accidentally, touched, shared, forgotten and then remembered at exactly the wrong moment. They can attach to objects, words, even melodies. One old song, forbidden in 2 city-states, was said to cause drought if sung near a fig orchard. Another was only to be performed upside down. No one remembers why. They just know the last person who did it upright was eaten by his own sandals. Eventually you piece together a theory. The curse wasn't aimed at you. It wasn't even meant for your bloodline. It was caught. Caught by your mother or someone trying to help someone else with a badly worded blessing that doubled as an accidental condemnation. That's the problem with divine language. One misstep and you've turned a wish for fertility into a 3-generation ban on restful sleep. You begin to accept it, not in resignation, in rhythm. You light the candles, you say the words, you leave offerings not to fix the curse but to keep it from getting bored. Because that's when they get clever. That's when the curse starts rewriting itself, shifting its symptoms, testing your patience. One day, your hair refuses to lie flat. The next, every olive you touch goes sour. Then your reflection blinks a beat too late. You learn to treat the curse like an unwanted roommate. Give it boundaries, feed it distractions, a joke here, a sacrificial loaf there. You survive together, uneasily, but you survive. And just when you think you've adjusted, the wind shifts. The sky darkens, but not with storm. A messenger arrives, not from Olympus, from below. Because your curse isn't the only thing you've inherited. Now the underworld wants a word. In ancient Greece, the underworld wasn't a fiery wasteland filled with pitchforks and devils. That's a later invention. The Greek underworld was quieter, colder, and far more administrative. If anything, it resembled an eternal archive. Souls weren't so much punished as they were processed, sorted, filed. And for someone like you, born half mortal, half divine, there was almost certainly a file with your name on it, cross-referenced with multiple divine departments, and probably written in at least 3 dialects of ancient Greek. Hades, the god of the underworld, wasn't feared because he was cruel. He was feared because he was thorough. Unlike his thunder-happy brother on Olympus, Hades didn't meddle. He didn't seek worship. He didn't issue flashy decrees. He simply enforced order. In a world of unpredictable gods and impulsive curses, Hades was consistency. You lived. You died. You were filed. The Greeks divided the underworld into multiple regions, each assigned based on how you lived, and in some cases, how spectacularly you failed. The average soul went to the fields of asphodel. Not good, not bad. Just filed under miscellaneous. Heroic souls, or those with divine favour, went to the Elysian fields, a kind of celestial gated community. And the truly cursed, they were directed to the fields of punishment. Not because Hades was angry, but because somewhere an offence had triggered a formality that had to be honoured. If a god demanded retribution, Hades processed the paperwork. The ancient Greeks treated death not as an end, but a transition into another bureaucracy. There were rivers to cross, Styx, Lethe, Acheron, each symbolising something different. Oath, forgetfulness, sorrow. There were gates, guardians, and judges. You didn't just arrive and float. You stood trial. 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, presided over these decisions. Their names were etched into myths like signatures on binding contracts. Your life boiled down to a judgment summary. For mortals, the process was already intricate. But for demigods like you, born out of divine interference, questionable consent, and usually at least one transformation involving livestock, it was far more complicated. Half-gods didn't just die. They were tracked, evaluated, monitored like unstable investments in a cosmic economy. Your actions weren't just your own. They were reflections of your divine parent. And given Zeus's reputation, you were probably already under suspicion before you could walk. There's historical precedent for this. Inscriptions and surviving fragments of mystery cult practices suggest that some individuals believed they'd face special scrutiny in the afterlife based on divine ancestry. Certain Orphic burial tablets even instructed souls on what to say and where to go upon entering the underworld, essentially spiritual cheat sheets to help navigate the divine system without being looped into endless bureaucratic error. These weren't symbolic, they were practical. Imagine entering a DMV where eternity is the wait time. You'd want directions too. Temples in the mortal realm sometimes mirrored this spiritual administration. Offerings weren't just gifts, they were receipts, a way of marking that you'd paid your dues. Priests track them. The gods supposedly track them too. Failure to offer properly could result in bad luck, illness, or more complex divine penalties that trickled into the underworld's filing system, like overdue library fines from the heavens. It wasn't just offerings, it was behaviour. Were you pious? Did you perform rituals correctly? Did you ever desecrate a sacred grove, mock a nymph, or build a shrine out of improper materials? If so, that might have generated a subfolder under your spiritual record. And if your lineage included divine blood, then congratulations. Your record was flagged for divine oversight. Eternal surveillance was standard protocol for demigods. What makes all of this especially complicated is that the Greek underworld was not unified in belief. Different city-states had variations. Some thought the soul wandered freely. Others believed in subterranean courts. But across all versions, one thing remained constant. The underworld remembered, it documented, and it never lost a file. So if you were to visit the underworld, not in death, but through divine request, prophetic vision, or unfortunate magical accident, you wouldn't be greeted with flames or screams. You'd be met with silence, a sense of being expected, and possibly an official who has already pulled your scroll and is tapping their stylus while waiting for you to stop sweating. Your file would be thick. Every sacrifice you've offered, every prayer you've fumbled, every time you forgot to bow properly before entering a sacred site. It would include your inherited curses, of which there are many, and every monster encounter you failed to report to the proper divine department. You'd be reviewed, not out of spite, but because that's what the underworld does. It reviews everyone, eternally. To the Greeks, even memory was part of this process. The river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, was said to cleanse souls before reincarnation. But some cults taught their followers to avoid Lethe and drink from Mnemosyne, the river of memory, instead, to retain knowledge and escape the cycle. This wasn't just metaphysical philosophy, it was an escape clause, a way of rejecting erasure in favour of accountability. Even in death, you could choose to remember the system that governed you, and that system still remembers you. So if you ever feel like something unseen is taking notes, if your dreams begin to include hallways filled with parchment and silent judges who tap their fingers in unison, it may not be metaphor. It may be that somewhere, deep in the divine archives, your life is being evaluated for irregularities. The actions you took, the mistakes you inherited, the prayers you forgot, all of it neatly transcribed in handwriting you'll never recognize but will somehow feel painfully familiar. You are a footnote in a divine ledger, and someone somewhere is deciding whether to file you under resolved or pending. You don't see them, not directly. That's part of the problem. The Olympian gods don't show up to explain themselves. They appear in wind gusts, suspiciously timed lightning strikes, or vaguely judgmental dreams about being late to a ceremony that doesn't exist. And yet, somehow, you're still expected to understand their expectations, because like the worst upper management in history, they communicate exclusively through cryptic memos, contradictory instructions, and ominous weather. This is how the divine hierarchy works. The ancient Greeks believed the gods lived atop Mount Olympus, not metaphorically, but geographically. The mountain itself was sacred, veiled in clouds, unreachable, unknowable. It was heaven with footpaths. But while the setting may have sounded idyllic, the actual organisational structure of Olympus resembled less a divine utopia and more a severely dysfunctional workplace run by immortal narcissists who couldn't be fired and had no HR department. At the top sat Zeus, your father. which in theory means you should have some advantages. Priority seating at temple rituals, favourable omens, maybe even a few enchanted objects. But in practice, being Zeus's child is like being the intern everyone resents because you got the job through nepotism, and then immediately got assigned to the most unstable team in the cosmos. You aren't technically on Olympus, you're not invited to meetings, you don't get a lyre-shaped keycard, but you are part of the legacy. Which means you still get blamed when things go wrong, and you are constantly uncomfortably aware that your extended divine relatives are watching you like upper management watches a security feed they pretend doesn't exist. If you were to chart the Olympian relationships on a whiteboard, you'd run out of ink. Zeus is married to Hera, but also fathered most of the demigods in existence with anyone who stood still long enough. Hera, in response, has spent eternity lashing out at those illegitimate children, sometimes by proxy, sometimes with very targeted weather patterns. Poseidon sulks in the sea and floods cities when people mispronounce his name. Hades lurks below, not angry, just annoyed, that no one ever sends him invitations. Aphrodite causes drama, Ares causes war, Apollo causes music, prophecies, and a vague sense of self-importance. Dionysus drinks through it all and insists it's performance art. To the Greeks, these weren't just myths. They were reflections of the world, a way to explain why nature was inconsistent, why politics were unstable, and why absolutely no one could agree on the correct date for festivals. If the gods were this petty, then surely mortal failures were forgivable, and yet, ironically, mortals were held to higher standards. If you misstepped, you might get turned into a plant. If a god did it, it was considered a metaphor. As a demigod, you occupy the worst of both worlds. The gods don't fully claim you, but they still expect you to act as a brand ambassador. You're mortal enough to bleed, but divine enough to make enemies you've never met. One ill-timed sacrifice, and suddenly Artemis is offended because you used rosemary instead of thyme. She sends a bear. You survive. But now the bear follows you around, muttering about ingredient authenticity. The gods rarely give direct instruction. That would be too efficient. Instead, they prefer signs, dreams, ominous coincidences. One of the most common divine communication methods was the epiphania, a sudden appearance or sensation believed to indicate a god's will. These might occur during rituals, moments of crisis, or particularly dramatic thunderclaps. There was no user manual, just a growing list of things you weren't supposed to do if the wind changed direction. It's not personal. The gods behaved this way with everyone. They were known for picking favourites one minute and abandoning them the next. Achilles had divine armour and a death sentence. Odysseus got home eventually, but only after years of god-fueled detours and at least 2 incidents involving edible lotuses. The gods didn't play favourites so much as they occasionally remembered people existed. What makes it worse is that many of the gods have overlapping responsibilities. Apollo, for instance, governs both healing and disease. So if you're struck with plague, it might be a punishment. Or it might be a cure. Hermes handles travellers, thieves, and messages. So when your coin purse disappears en route to a temple, is that theft or divine correspondence? You'll never know. The gods do not issue follow-up emails. Worse still is their tendency to interfere in mortal affairs based on personal vendettas. Athena might support you if your strategy is clever. But if you insulted owls recently, she might withhold that support just long enough for you to trip on your own sandal during a sacred foot race. Demeter is generous with harvests. Unless someone somewhere forgot to water a wheat field dedicated to her, then everyone suffers, you included. Even silence can be suspicious. The absence of a divine sign was often interpreted as a sign itself. In Delphi, silence from the oracle was treated as a message of its own, typically one that suggested the gods were annoyed, distracted, or playing some long game no mortal mind could comprehend. You learn to read into everything. A sudden storm, a flock of birds, an unusually sarcastic goat. It's all data, all feedback, all part of the divine feedback loop that never ends but never explains itself. And yet, despite the chaos, you are still expected to uphold your end of the bargain. Attend festivals, make offerings, speak their names with reverence, even when they ignore you, even when they contradict each other, even when one god tells you to build a temple and another tells you to burn it down because it clashes with the local architecture. You're not just surviving, you're navigating a divine workplace with no rules, no boundaries, and no consistent performance review process. And somewhere in the middle of it all, you still have to find purpose. Not because the gods care, but because the moment you stop trying, they'll notice, and then they'll care, and you'll find yourself turned into a constellation that no one can agree how to pronounce. You were never supposed to be popular. Not like this. Not with them. The gods have noticed you, which in Greek mythology is rarely a compliment. In theory, divine favour sounds like the best case scenario. A god notices your deeds, likes your style, and bestows upon you some kind of blessing. Maybe a bit of luck, maybe a magical item, maybe protection in battle or a whisper of prophecy before you make a dramatic speech. That's how it's supposed to work. But in practice, divine favour in ancient Greece was more like an unpredictable sponsorship deal, with impossible expectations, built-in jealousy, and a high probability of accidental combustion. The ancient Greeks had a complicated relationship with divine attention. On one hand, they prayed for it. On the other hand, they feared it. Because when a god favoured you, it meant you were now part of their reputation. You became a proxy for their pride, their power, and most dangerously, their rivalries. If another god disapproved of that attention, they wouldn't go after your patron. They'd go after you. And you, unfortunately, are particularly visible. You carry divine blood. You've survived curses. You've interacted with monsters without dying horribly or being turned into moss. You've shown just enough resilience to attract curiosity, the kind that ripples up Olympus like gossip through temple corridors. Now the gods are watching, some with interest, some with suspicion, and all of them with opinions. Favour didn't work the way most mortals hoped. It wasn't bestowed with a ceremony. There was no announcement. It just happened. Subtly at first. Your crops grew better. Your injuries healed faster. You won more arguments. Strangers began to speak to you with unearned familiarity. And then came the dreams, the symbols, the odd coincidences, a cloud shaped like a lyre, a dove that follows you everywhere, a statue that weeps when you pass by, possibly from joy, possibly from nausea. You're not sure. If you were in a polis like Athens or Corinth, this would lead to attention. Temple priests might start inviting you to rituals. Local poets might include you in their odes. Someone might paint your likeness on a vase, probably with exaggerated calves and a suspiciously serene expression. These public signs of favour were dangerous, because for every admirer, there was someone wondering which god you'd offended by getting too close to another. Jealousy wasn't reserved for mortals. The gods were infamously possessive. Hera once cursed a priestess simply because Zeus looked at her too long. Athena turned a weaving prodigy into a spider for daring to be good at something in her presence. Aphrodite cursed a queen to fall in love with a bull, a choice that still confuses scholars and ruins dinner parties. In each case, the mistake wasn't arrogance, it was proximity to divine attention. You might think you can manage this, that if you stay respectful, humble, and generous with your offerings, the gods will treat you gently. But ancient Greek history offers very little reassurance on that front. Even the most pious mortals weren't spared. In fact, sometimes their piety made them more vulnerable. Niobe was a queen who boasted about her many children, implying she was more blessed than Leto, mother of Apollo and Artemis. The result? Her children were slain, and she was turned into a stone that weeps forever. The message was clear: don't compare divine favour. Or if you must, do it in private and without adjectives. There were entire professions built around managing this divine ego imbalance. Seers, diviners, omen interpreters, people who made a living reading entrails, watching bird patterns, and determining whether or not you could accept that golden olive wreath without risking an earthquake. They'd tell you when to pray, how to phrase it, what incense to use, and which gods might currently be sulking and therefore should not be invoked under any circumstances. Favour could also be revoked at any moment. One forgotten sacrifice, one slightly blasphemous joke, one ill-timed flirtation with the wrong statue, and suddenly the blessings stop. The skies darken, the birds scatter, you stub your toe so hard it becomes a metaphor. And just like that, you've gone from chosen to cautionary tale. The real problem is that divine favour isn't exclusive. You might be protected by Apollo, but that doesn't mean you're safe from Poseidon, or Artemis, or some obscure rustic deity whose shrine you once used as a picnic table. The gods don't operate as a unified brand. They operate more like rival departments in a divine corporation, each one with its own metrics, mood swings, and tendency to file complaints in the form of metaphorical disasters. That's why navigating favour becomes a balancing act. You can't be too successful. That attracts envy. You can't be too obscure. That attracts neglect. You have to hover in that sweet spot. Useful, but not threatening. Respected, but not adored. Known, but not sung about. The moment a bard writes a song in your name, you're in danger. Not from mortals, from the gods. Even festivals were minefields. A public ritual in honour of one god was, by implication, an insult to another. If the meat was overcooked, if the dancers stumbled, if the hymns skipped a line, that wasn't just a mistake. That was grounds for divine retribution. And if you were the favoured guest, the one basking in the supposed blessings of Olympus, it was often your head on the celestial chopping block. The Greeks understood this. That's why most temples kept emergency altars to other gods on standby, just in case. You might be at a celebration for Demeter, but there was a small shrine to Hades in the corner. Quiet, respectful, in case he dropped by and wanted to be acknowledged. You don't forget the underworld. Not if you want your crops to grow and your dreams to remain nightmare-free. In the end, divine favour is less a reward and more a warning label. It means you've been seen. And now you have to survive that attention without becoming a headline in the next tragic myth. So you offer incense. You pour libations with both hands. You smile at statues you're not entirely sure are sentient. And when someone asks which god favours you most, you smile politely and change the subject. Because you're not here to win. You're here to endure. You don't mean to offend anyone. You're just trying to exist. Quietly. Cautiously. With a reasonable level of divine respect and a slightly overdeveloped fear of thunder. But in ancient Greece, offence isn't about intent. It's about interpretation. And the gods interpret everything. There is no neutral action. You sneeze. That could be a sign of truth, or deceit, or divine disapproval depending on who's nearby and what direction you're facing. You spill wine. It might signal bad luck, the wrath of Dionysus, or the need to build a small altar out of bread and apologize. You yawn too widely during a ritual, and someone nearby suggests that your soul is trying to escape. This is not metaphor. They mean it literally. A wandering soul is an open invitation for spiritual parasites. You close your mouth. The problem is not that you're careless. The problem is that you're breathing in a world built on divine etiquette that no one fully understands. The gods, as worshipped in ancient Greece, had preferences. Specific ones. Sometimes contradictory. And you were expected to anticipate them. That's the danger of living in a polytheistic system where every moment, from mealtime to bath time to how you scratch your ankle during an eclipse, can be interpreted as either reverence or rebellion. For instance, there are rules about food, not just what you eat, but how. Certain gods disapproved of garlic, others demanded it. Cutting bread the wrong way might attract spirits. Eating figs too early in the season might be seen as an insult to Demeter, and offering honey to the wrong deity could result in bees, not metaphorical bees, literal, vengeful, divine bees, the kind that know your full name and aren't above pollinating your nightmares. Even how you speak is dangerous. Puns were risky. Humour could offend. Saying a god's name at the wrong time, in the wrong context, while standing on the wrong floor tile, might trigger something. Not necessarily dramatic, maybe just a week of cursed sleep, or your sandals constantly squeaking. But the Greeks took these small afflictions seriously. They were signs, omens, early warnings that your cosmic behaviour report was trending poorly. Gestures mattered too. Bowing was not just a physical act. It had to be done at the correct angle, with the appropriate number of finger placements, facing the right direction. You didn't wave at statues, that was considered cheeky. You didn't lean on altars, that was considered desecration. And you never, under any circumstances, touched a sacred object unless explicitly told to by someone who looked like they hadn't blinked in 3 days. That person was usually a temple official, or cursed, or both. This wasn't paranoia, it was policy. Greek religion was not built around belief, it was built around action, orthopraxy, not orthodoxy. The gods didn't care if you loved them, they cared if you performed the ritual correctly. They didn't want your affection, they wanted your obedience, which meant every ritual had to be precise, every offering measured, every chant delivered without improvisation. If you said, "Blessed is the vine," when you were supposed to say, "May the vine be blessed," that could be grounds for divine disappointment. And disappointment in divine terms usually came with weather. This extended to clothing. White was generally preferred for purity, but too much white. That could imply arrogance. Wearing purple might please one god and irritate another. Jewellery was complicated. Certain stones were sacred, others were considered profane. And wearing a laurel crown outside of sanctioned festivals, that was practically shouting, "Strike me down" at Apollo. There were entire priestly classes whose sole job was to interpret these things, to walk into your home, smell the air, observe your fig placement, and inform you that you had accidentally offended Artemis by hanging your laundry too close to a goat. You paid them to say this, then you paid them again to fix it, usually with a small sacrifice, or a much larger one depending on how much goat proximity was involved. Even dreams could be offensive. If you dreamed of a god in a way that was too casual, that was hubris. If you didn't dream of them at all, that could be interpreted as negligence. And if you dreamed of them doing something unflattering, say tripping on a cloud or mispronouncing a spell, you were expected to perform purification rites, just in case. Architecture had rules too. Your house couldn't cast a shadow on a shrine, your olive tree couldn't lean toward a sacred spring, your toilet couldn't face east if you lived within a certain distance of a temple dedicated to a chthonic deity. One city-state reportedly fined a homeowner because their chimney smoke blew over a shrine on feast day. The smoke was considered impure. The fine included goats. So what do? You adapt. Slowly. You stop whistling indoors. You check which way the birds are flying before lighting a fire. You stop wearing jewellery altogether because one of your rings once gave you a nosebleed during a thunderstorm and you still haven't figured out why. You begin apologising to inanimate objects just in case. You bow to trees, you bow to puddles, you bow to the moon, and still, it happens. Someone sees you eating lentils on the wrong lunar day and whispers that your crops will fail. A priest tells you that you laughed too loudly during a procession and must now carry water uphill as penance. You step into a sacred grove without removing your shoes, and later find a tick on your leg shaped exactly like the letter Alpha. You take it as a sign. You offer it to Hermes. He declines. This is the nature of divine etiquette in the ancient world. You're always one step away from unintended offence, not because you are reckless, but because the rules shift. They evolve. They're interpreted through local tradition, family superstition, and whatever mood the gods happen to be in when they see your face. Which is why the safest thing you can do is remain mildly reverent at all times. Not too loud, not too quiet, not too showy, never bored, always alert. Because the gods are watching, and they do not believe in overreacting. At some point you stop being a person and start being a metaphor. You don't remember when it happened exactly. Maybe it was after the third time someone pointed to your left foot and claimed it resembled a crescent moon. Maybe it was when a passing oracle declared that your sneeze signalled the collapse of an empire. Or maybe it was when you caught a travelling priest sketching your shadow into a scroll labelled Signs of the Divine Goat. You ask what it means. He says he doesn't know yet, but it feels important. This is how it starts. You're no longer just a demigod. You're raw material for prophecy. Ancient Greece was obsessed with symbols, not as decoration, but as communication. The gods, after all, didn't speak plainly. They sent signs, the rustle of leaves, the movement of birds, the shape of clouds. And when those signs weren't clear enough, people began assigning meaning to others, especially to people like you. You're part human, part divine, which means everything you do can be interpreted. Your gestures, your clothing, the number of olives on your dinner plate, it's all potential prophecy, all eligible for metaphorical conscription. The Greeks didn't just believe in fate, they believed in fate that needed interpreting, and they built an entire infrastructure to support it. Oracles at places like Delphi and Dodona became central to civic life, not because they gave helpful advice, but because they gave cryptic messages wrapped in enough ambiguity to fit almost any situation. And when those messages were too vague, someone like you could be pointed to as the physical embodiment of the answer. You trip in the marketplace, a sign of instability in the polis. You grow a white streak in your hair, clearly a divine warning about upcoming frost. You appear in someone's dream holding a fish. That fish is now a political symbol, and your presence in the dream is proof that the gods approve of the speaker's new barley taxation policies. And it gets worse. Once people start seeing you as a symbol, they stop treating you like a person. You're no longer allowed to be tired or grumpy or confused. If you yawn during a ritual, they call it a cosmic signal. If you wear mismatched sandals, someone carves it into stone as a metaphor for divine duality. One time, you accidentally drop a loaf of bread into a river. 3 priests debate whether this means that Poseidon is hungry, or that you are the chosen one foretold in a particularly clumsy set of rhyming verses. You try to object, but then someone writes your objection down and claims it's a parable. The Greeks were prolific with allegory. They used stories, images, and people to convey divine truths, even when those truths were invented on the spot. The Aesopic tradition is full of animals standing in for political critiques. Homeric epics turn bodily scars into symbols of hidden identity. Statues weren't just representations, they were vessels, icons. Some people believed certain statues sweated or bled when significant events were approaching. You start to wonder what it means when your nose won't stop itching during equinox. Someone suggests it means war. You're not consulted about this. Symbolic people rarely are. It wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was well-meaning. A village might build a shrine to you after interpreting your sneeze as a cure for infertility. You try to correct them, but they're already offering goat milk and naming babies after your sandals. One man swears his eyesight returned after smelling your hair from a distance. You move camps. At other times it's opportunistic. A politician claims your limp proves the gods favour his land reforms. A travelling bard says you were born during a thunderstorm, and therefore must endorse his dramatic retelling of the Trojan War, in which all the main characters are also birds. You try to avoid these people, but they find you. Symbols have a hard time hiding, and the danger is this: once you're symbolic, you become disposable. Because symbols are only useful as long as they mean something convenient. If your metaphor expires, you're tossed aside, rewritten, transformed, literal transformation in some cases. There are stories of people being turned into constellations, not as reward, but as narrative closure. One woman was turned into a swan-shaped wind because her dreams became too difficult to interpret. A boy was turned into a cave echo because people mistook his voice for divine judgment. You start whispering less. Even sacred texts are rewritten around you. A clay tablet in one temple lists your name among omens involving earthquakes, spoiled olives, and the sound of bees screaming. You didn't cause any of these things, but someone needed an explanation, and your face was convenient. And through it all, the gods remain silent. They're not the ones assigning your symbolism, that's the mortals, but the gods allow it. Because sometimes mortals being wrong is more entertaining than being right. Eventually you stop resisting. You lean into it. If someone says your frown is a sign of impending drought, you arch an eyebrow and mutter something vague about clouds. They gasp, take notes, offer figs. You accept them. You're tired. You're hungry. And if being the personification of meteorological uncertainty gets you dinner, so be it. But it wears on you. Not being misunderstood. Being understood in ways that aren't real. You lose track of where you end and the metaphor begins. And just when you think you've stabilised, just when your symbology starts to settle into a manageable cycle of confusion and fruit offerings, a new oracle rises, and they name you, not as a symbol, but as a problem. It was only a matter of time. You've been misquoted in dreams, painted into myths, and used as a metaphor for everything from storm season to spoiled lentils. But now things have escalated. An oracle has spoken, publicly, loudly, with dramatic hand gestures, and according to her, you're not a blessing. You're not a chosen one. You're a cosmic mistake. The term she uses isn't poetic, it's bureaucratic, something like misaligned fragment of fate, or unauthorized divine continuity error. It's the kind of phrase that sounds like it came from a scroll that was meant to be burned, or maybe a cursed index card left behind in the underworld's forgotten drawer of problematic bloodlines. This isn't a personal insult, this is theological classification. In ancient Greece, oracles weren't just spiritual figures, they were policymakers, judicial consultants, divine customer service representatives who interpreted the will of the gods and fed it back to mortals in riddles, metaphors, and occasional word puzzles carved into goat bones. When an oracle spoke, cities listened, wars were launched, colonies were established, marriages were cancelled, and reputations were permanently rewritten. Delphi was the most famous, a sanctuary of Apollo, built around a fissure in the earth believed to release prophetic vapours. The Pythia, its high priestess, was often in a trance, speaking cryptically while attendants jotted down her every word. Other sites, like Dodona or Claros, had different methods. Dodona's priests interpreted the rustling of oak leaves. Claros used subterranean springs. Some oracles drank sacred water, others inhaled smoke. A few just stared at fire until it blinked first. Regardless of method, their words carried institutional weight. And now one of them has declared you incompatible with the fabric of reality. This is not ideal. You don't get a hearing. There's no divine appeals process. Once the oracle has spoken, the message spreads. Through gossip, through temple networks, through enthusiastic bards who immediately begin composing ballads with titles like the Misaligned One or the Off-Key Demigod. You overhear one that compares your existence to a lyre string that keeps snapping, no matter how many times it's tuned. You don't play the lyre, That doesn't matter. People start treating you differently. Temple guards stare longer. Priests stop asking for your opinion. A travelling merchant insists you touched his donkey, and now it refuses to walk in straight lines. You try to explain that the donkey was already drunk, but he's halfway through composing a curse tablet before you finish your sentence. This isn't exile, not yet, but it's exile adjacent, a kind of theological cold shoulder. No one wants to offend the gods by being too close to someone labelled defective by the divine system, and no one wants to be next on the oracle's bad side, because that's the thing about oracles, their accuracy was never guaranteed. Their authority came not from certainty, but from tradition and fear. In many cases, oracles were deliberately vague. They offered options, interpretations, loopholes. But every now and then, one would speak with clarity. That clarity was terrifying, because it offered no room for manoeuvring. If an oracle said a city would fall, that city started drafting evacuation plans. If an oracle said a demigod was a divine misfire, people started hiding their children and polishing their altar stones. You begin to wonder what the oracle meant. Did she mean your lineage was flawed? That Zeus shouldn't have fathered you? That your existence contradicted some forgotten prophecy or divine schedule? The Greeks believed fate was woven by the Moirai, the fates who spun, measured, and cut the threads of life. Maybe yours was knotted, or fraying, or made from the wrong material entirely. It could be anything. A misstep in a ritual, a forgotten sacrifice, a minor shrine you disrespected by standing too close with muddy feet. In a religious system governed by signs and patterns, your entire life is a walking contradiction. The gods might love chaos, but they don't love unsanctioned chaos, and you apparently are that. The oracle doesn't rescind her statement. She doubles down, offers elaboration, claims that your aura glows sideways, that your footsteps echo backward, that birds stop singing when you approach, because even nature isn't sure which myth you belong to. You consider hiding, leaving, starting over in a region that hasn't yet received the divine memo about your cosmic misalignment. But Greek religion wasn't regional, it was networked. Oracles communicated, priests travelled, even satyrs had opinions. You wouldn't get far before someone recognised your face from a fresco labelled, "Do not invite to ritual." So instead you adapt. You stop making eye contact during ceremonies. You offer sacrifices to neutral gods, the ones no one's sure what they do. You begin speaking in riddles, just like the oracles do, because if you're going to be misunderstood, you might as well be cryptic about it. Strangely, it works, not because people forgive you, but because they get confused. Confusion, in ancient religion, was often interpreted as mystery, and mystery was sacred. Your status shifts again, from misalignment to enigma, from error to omen. A temple begins collecting your discarded sandals. A priest declares that your sideways aura is a sign of divine transformation. Someone dreams of you and immediately sacrifices 2 doves and a pomegranate just to be safe. This is the cycle. You're judged, you're exiled, you're interpreted, and then you are reabsorbed into the very system that tried to discard you. Not because it makes sense, but because the gods enjoy narrative symmetry. And nothing is more symmetrical than turning a mistake into a myth. You're still an error, but now you are a meaningful one, which in the Greek world is about as close to immortality as anyone gets. And so, after curses, monsters, prophecies, sacred goats, cosmic filing cabinets, and at least 3 different oracles calling you confusing things, you've made it. Somehow. You've dodged divine bureaucracy, survived symbolic reinterpretation, and only been turned into a metaphor 5 or 6 times, which, historically speaking, is a pretty solid record for someone with Zeus's DNA. You've been ignored by gods, judged by furniture, shadowed by talking birds, and may or may not be responsible for a thunderstorm that hit 3 days early. But you're still here, still breathing, still trying to remember whether that tree outside your hut is your half-sibling or just a tree. And while the gods remain unpredictable, moody, and deeply allergic to accountability, one thing is certain: you are legendary. Not necessarily for the right reasons, but legendary nonetheless. Now close your eyes, rest your metaphorical aura, and if a giant eagle starts circling above your house in the morning, don't panic. It probably just wants to borrow a scroll, or deliver another prophecy about your sandals. Good night, and may your divine paperwork remain mostly filed.